Hi, and welcome to the Writer's Den. My name is Jane Waters Thomas, and today we are going to be interviewing a returning guest, a returning writer, author, poet, and now professor, John Davis Jr. Welcome, John.
Thank you, Jane. It's good to be here again.
Great. I want to talk today, we're going to just jump right into the newest book of four that you now have published, if I'm correct there,
Sure.
And talk a little bit about just what the motivation was for the book. The name of the book, Hard Inheritance, and if you would share a little bit about what the inspiration to do this book was and where that came from.
Okay. Hard Inheritance really came about as a result of my first book. This was almost like the follow-up or the sequel to it. Middle Class American Proverb came out in 2014, shortly after I finished the Master of Fine Arts program at University of Tampa. And those who have read it before will know that it deals a lot with kind of my rural upbringing here in Central Florida. It deals with everything from citrus growing to education to journalism, and it was just really kind of a Duke's mixture, if you will, of different influences. This newest book, Hard Inheritance, is really more centrally focused on the history of our area as well as some of the cultural markers that we have here in Central Florida. As a seventh generation Floridian myself, I felt that it was important to celebrate that heritage with poetry, and that's really what Hard Inheritance does in a way that is both approachable as well as literary.
Now, when you were putting together Hard Inheritance, and there would have had to have been some research and some extensive background coverage, I would think, if you were really capturing sort of the culture of the Central Florida region. Can you talk a little bit about the process that you went through in putting together the information and then taking that information and creatively coming up with the poetry that we find in the book?
Sure. As I mentioned, a lot of this poetry comes from my own background as a seventh generation Floridian, and so the research in this case was actually semi-autobiographical. There's an awful lot of pieces in the book that don't necessarily have to do with my own individual experience, but it's based upon the experiences of those that I have known, and you know, various stories and various pieces of folklore from our area that have just frankly been fascinating enough to warrant or to generate poetry. I guess you could say one of the types of research that I did was basically grow up in a place that was known for its citrus and for its cattle and for its long Florida heritage, really, because that's where a lot of the poetry comes from.
That's very exciting, and definitely being native myself right here to Polk County, it's a lot of fun to read from the perspective of having grown up here. What are you hoping for in response from the readers of this local region?
I'm really hoping that the readers who encounter this book will find that there's just an awful lot that they identify with. You know, a lot of times we read poetry from contemporary authors and canonized authors alike, and while it speaks to us, it isn't necessarily comprised of things that we can relate to on a local or a more intimate level. And an awful lot of the poems that are in this collection deal with matters, with geography, with history, with subjects that I think Polk County, Hardee County, Highlands County, the heart of Florida really, will very deeply identify with. And that's kind of what I'm hoping, that people will pick that up and say, yeah, me too. You know,
Right.
I've been here, I've done this, maybe I just didn't write a poem about it, but this is saying something that I've always felt.
And what a great way to connect with our local population through poetry, through a written art form that, as you just mentioned, maybe they haven't thought. You know, we've read stories, we've read many books that are fact-based about our region, but to have a book of poems about our region is a unique perspective in writing, I think.
Absolutely. Regional literature has always had a place that's very near and dear to my heart because a lot of my influences when I was growing up, as far as writing was concerned, were regional poets themselves. Robert Frost being a poet of New England. And similar names, similar canonized authors that I began reading, I noticed had a very strong connection to place. And so my own poetry, even when I was, say, 12 years old and I was writing on the top of my grandparents' barn roof, a lot of the poems that I generated had that connection to place, not only because I felt it myself, but because my writing role models also had that very strong connection that I wanted to emulate.
So if you just, you mentioned writing in your grandmother, and the thought that occurred to me is, how very long have you been writing?
I have been writing seriously probably since about my sophomore year of college. Now, I was writing poems and poetry prior to that point, but the truth of the matter is the first serious poetry that I produced was produced when I was an undergrad at Florida Southern College. Interestingly enough, I was not an English major. I had one creative writing course as an elective, and then the rest of the Englishes that I took were all mandatory courses. But I would kind of seek out places of solitude on campus and write my own poems based upon those that I had encountered in classes like American literature and Western lit and that sort of thing. It didn't occur to me at that time that, maybe you ought to be an English major.
Right. Right.
I was really hooked on journalism, and I really enjoyed the act of seeking out information and reporting it and that sort of thing. But then, of course, as I matured, I sort of came to a better understanding of myself as a writer, which is what led me to the MFA, the Master of Fine Arts at University of Tampa.
Well, and today you now are instructing as a professor at a local college, and when you're teaching the art of poetry, what kind of gratification does that give to you to know that as you just mentioned, I didn't even think that I would be doing, are you talking to the kids that are the next generation of our poets and our authors?
Yeah, to a certain degree. The students that I have right now are very career-minded. Most of them are headed toward jobs either in the medical field or in business, occasionally education, but all of my students that I currently teach in classes like American Literature and English Comp and similar courses kind of already have a goal in mind, and while it might not necessarily be related to the literary arts, that's something they can take with them anywhere, because the critical analysis skills that you developed in classes like American Literature and English Comp are applicable in any field. And by the time they leave my class, it is my aspiration that they take that realization with them, that, this wasn't just about looking at stories, looking at poems, looking at articles or essays and saying this is true and this is not, but rather looking at the whole world with a critical eye and being able to discern truth from untruth.
I would think that would be, especially dealing with the generation and the dynamic changes that we're seeing in college students today compared to 20 years ago college students. I would think that in looking at some of these students, that as a professor or an educator looking out across that field, if you saw one diamond in the rough, you would just snatch them up and talk to them about the importance of writing from your perspective. Yes,
absolutely. A lot of times the students that I teach have an innate interest in creative writing. I think of one young lady right now who, I'll just use her first name, April. She was in my American literature class just recently, and whenever I would give an assignment that was more creative in nature, she just naturally took to it. It's one of those cases where I could tell that it was an interest of hers, but no one had necessarily been encouraging that. So to go back to your question, when I see students who have that innate interest, even if they just want to do it on the amateur level, even if they just want to do it as a hobby, yeah, I think that's an important thing to foster. That's an important thing for us to scaffold and support.
Wonderful. Well, you have definitely another fabulous part of your book that I want to talk a little bit about. That includes another local artist, and that's artist Tina Clark. And she did the cover of your book, and we have the original piece here with us today. Talk to me a little bit about, you've written all these amazing poems. Now you need to come up with a book cover, and how do you go about selecting an artist to help design and create really just the showpiece of what people are looking at?
Yeah. I had known Tina from prior works of hers. We had also worked together on a number of local municipal efforts there in the city of Winter Haven. And I had seen her work, and I very much respect her work. And I knew that for this particular volume, I needed something that was going to not just reflect the content of the subject matter of the poetry, but in addition, give the cover, that is, a sort of intrigue, give it kind of, give the reader a provocation to open that cover, to open that book and find out what's going on here. And Tina's work definitely arouses that curiosity in the viewer. And I knew that she would definitely be the person to go to for this kind of assignment, because having seen her other work and having known how she works creatively, I had just an awful lot of positive expectations.
Yeah, and she definitely delivered a beautiful, beautiful piece for the cover. So what is, we all have favorite things that we do, and I think in a previous interview with you, I said, what is your favorite? So I have to ask, within the collection that is found in Heart Inheritance, the book that we're talking about today, what is some of your favorite work?
It's interesting. Whenever I was in the MFA program at UT, they said to us as aspiring poets and authors, whenever you put your poems together and you collect them, you're going to make your strongest poems first and your strongest poems last, and then try to weave in a few of the stronger ones kind of throughout in the middle, toward the back 2/3 of the book. And really, the last poem in this collection is one of my favorites. It actually ties back to the title of the work itself, in that the title of the poem that ends the book is Inheriting My Late Father's Cabin. And the whole book itself deals with issues of architecture. It deals with issues of what makes home exactly, whether that's a regional home or whether that's an actual physical home. And so that piece is kind of a capstone to the entire collection. It's one of my favorites. I have a select few, but that's the one that comes immediately to mind.
Wonderful. Do you feel like you could recite that poem for us? Do you have that?
Well, I can't.
Or read.
I can't necessarily recite it from memory, but I do have it with me here today, I believe. And so we'll just locate that, and we'll do a quick reading. Great.
Perfect.
This is Inheriting My Late Father's Cabin. In winter, the floorboards grow so cold here, my feet sometimes mistake them for water. Falling at night far from the gas heater's whisper, toes and pads and soles remember summer creek beds, tumbling cool brown stones smoothed over by whirls of crisp mountain currents. Your voice a few throws downstream, its timber among sycamores, warns me, not too far. In your former study's fireplace, embers behind the closed wire screen still simmer, and I borrow one of your gilt and leather books from its shelf, Plath, Hayden, Retke, or some other writer who penned their father too well in ink too dark sometime before or after he died. I sink in your chair, prop up my heels, feed wood to this dry fire.
How beautiful, absolutely beautiful. So in the collection, about how many different poems are in the collection?
There are 60 poems in the collection, and I believe the book itself is about 88 pages in length, because of course there's front matter and back matter. But this collection, the 60 poems that I have chosen for it, really are what I would call the cream of the crop. I write a lot of poetry, and I submit quite a bit to magazines and literary journals and that sort of thing, and I'm fortunate enough to be published pretty regularly. And most of the poems that are in this newest volume, Heart Inheritance, they have been featured in literary magazines that are very reputable, very well respected, like Nashville Review out of Vanderbilt University, for example. They're one place that published at least one of the poems in this volume, and so yeah, I'm very pleased.
Now, in publishing a book of this nature, and I know that you have had students go out and do public speaking and open mic sessions and things of that nature. Do you ever have an opportunity to go out and just read from the author's perspective your poetry?
You know, it's interesting. I have had a few opportunities like that. Recently, I've been a little more focused on volunteering because I think one of the things that's really important for poets and writers in general to do is to spread our love of the literary among those who may just be developing that same love or haven't had the opportunity to do so. Today, as an example, I was at my son's school. He attends a Montessori school here locally. And I was talking to the students about various forms that they can try out, just to kind of provide them with something new and different. Like, for example, the Diamante is a type of poem that is actually literally diamond-shaped, and kids especially tend to enjoy that, you know, just putting words into various and sundry shapes. And you know, that kind of opportunity, the volunteer opportunities that I've been able to take advantage of recently have been very meaningful. I am still doing readings. In fact, I'll have a book launch for Hard Inheritance in the early portion of 2017 because it came out right here in December. With the holiday season being as commercial as it is,
right,
trying to launch a book during that same time that is very competitive, especially a book of poetry, is not necessarily always the easiest thing to do. And so by having a more official launch in early 2017, I feel like it will have a little more visibility, and I also feel like people will be able to kind of slow down and appreciate it more than they would in the hustle and bustle of the holiday season.
Oh, I think it's the perfect plan of action for after the holidays to grab a book of poetry and sit down with something that you know, coffee, tea, whatever it is that you enjoy, and just relax, just chill out and enjoy.
Exactly.
So wonderful. Do you have another favorite poem that you could share with us?
As I mentioned, I grew up on a citrus farm, and a lot of my poems deal with the issue of the challenges of citrus farming, as well as some of the processes, some of the, I guess you would say, the practices that go into citrus farming itself. One piece that was picked up by the Lee County Alliance for the Arts for their Broadside series is entitled "What the Grove Knows." And that piece, it brings me a lot of joy because, of course, it tends to bring up memories of my own grandparents and of the farm itself. I was very fortunate that this was featured in the Broadside series for Lee County, and they gave it some good publicity when it first came out. This is what the grove knows. Trees whisper yes when you tractor. Limbs and leaves echo mumbles and whirs, diesel and steel, affirmations. Stirred soil lifts its secrets to the sky. Revealed and overturned crickets invite snowy egrets who eat them. Serpentine white-quilled necks plump with prey. Birds' citrus green eyes and orange beaks pierce gray land, supplier, provider. Morning mist mixes with dust and exhaust. Sun through branches patterns sanctuary, and you, farmer, bring this praise.
Oh, I love that. Yes, that is beautiful.
Thank you.
Beautiful.
Yeah.
So, as you move forward, and you've had some really amazing accomplishments. You know, you've been published many times. You're a professor now. You've written locally for quite some time. What is the one piece of advice you would pass on to a viewer of our audience to encourage them to try poetry, try to write poetry if they've not done that? What would maybe be that piece of advice to say, this is how you get started?
You know, it's funny because I just got done addressing that with a class full of 6th graders.
Right.
But yes, absolutely. I would say that poetry is for anybody. You don't necessarily have to have a fancy degree. You don't necessarily have to have a great deal of literary connection at the outset. One of the things that really drives poetry is, frankly, the human heart. And some of our best poetry has come from the most unexpected backgrounds. Tobacco farmers, steel workers, and the list goes on and on. But really and truly, anyone who has even an inkling that perhaps this is something they might want to try, it's open to everyone. It's not a closed field. It's something that is appreciated from all walks of life. And so certainly put pen to page and just give it your best. There's not necessarily, at the outset of things, there's not necessarily a right way or wrong way to begin. The idea is just to begin.
Well, I have to tell you that it brings up a thought of when I was a child, my father, hard-working guy, you know, graduated high school, but then just did his own thing in life. He was a construction worker, just worked really hard. But one of the things that he loved to do was write, and he would write small little poems on napkins and leave them randomly around for me or my brothers to find them. And I think about poetry and the influence that had on my life, even as a young girl. Just my father just randomly, quickly jotting down several lines and leaving it, you know, for morning, flying out the door. But poetry is heart. Poetry definitely comes from the heart, and it's a lot of fun to see how different walks of life write that. You know, how our different cultures and our different existences changes maybe the language of it, but the heart remains the same in poetry. It is a deep-seated passion poets seem to be and seem to have.
Definitely. You know, it's interesting you should bring up how parents and grandparents influence our own predilections toward various pieces of literature. The very first poem I remember looking at was actually on the wall of my grandparents' house. My grandfather was a World War II bomber pilot. He flew B-24s, and he flew 51 missions. And as a result of that, he was a recipient of the Distinguished Flying Cross and the Air Medal, and he had all of those on the wall. But right on the same wall with all of those medals was the poem by Major John Gillespie McGee, High Flight. And as a child, I would sit in my grandmother's chair, which was kind of facing the opposite direction, but I'd turn around, and just learning to read, I was able to make out words like, "Oh, I have slipped," and this one's a little fancy, "the surly bonds of earth." And, you know, maybe I wasn't able to do surly, but you get the idea.
Right.
I was able to kind of decipher and decode, and so poetry was actually one of the very first things that I read growing up as I did.
Well, we are thankful that you took it to heart and kept it moving, and we are looking forward to not only sharing with our viewers this book, Heart Inheritance, by John Davis Jr. If you look that up, definitely you'll see several other books that have been published, and we're looking forward to the next one. And I'm certain that you're probably already somewhere in your thoughts working on that book.
I am, actually. Since Heart Inheritance was sent to the publisher, I've had a number of pieces that have been published in journals, largely in Florida. And because my work has always kind of taken on that flavor of native Florida, if you will, I think this next piece, this next collection, will probably continue that tradition, kind of carry on the legacy. I don't want to say too much about it because, you know, it's still very developmental. But yes, there is another collection in the works.
Wonderful. John, thank you so much for being with us again on the Writer's Den. Always a pleasure to talk to you, and we just absolutely love the work that you do, and we're very thankful that you're here with us in Polk County, Florida, and representing Central Florida and beyond in your writing. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you, Jay.
For more information on John Davis Jr.'s book, Heart Inheritance, please visit Amazon.com, and you'll find all the information that you need right there. Thanks for visiting us, and we will see you again on Writer's Den.